As of a couple weeks ago, I'd only really wrapped one car. So if you were to have asked me what wrapping a car meant, I would have probably said it was really simple. But with just that little amount of experience, what did I really know?
After all, I was just making a couple videos on it. One of hundreds of videos online showing the exact same thing, all of which making it look way too simple. It was then I really started wrapping cars myself. Project TT was finally getting the wrap it deserved. The paint was failing, but more importantly than that, this job was being done by a complete amateur.
And by amateur, what I mean is that the previous car that I wrapped was entirely a learning experience. So in other words, there's a ton to improve on. Too bad, however, that the paint on the car we are currently attempting is far, far worse. So this could also just completely fail. This here is a rock. And if we think of this rock as how far we are now, i.e. just having wrapped the hood, I guess you could say I want to end up somewhere up there, getting the car to a point where we know that finishing it is going to be possible. Wrapping a whole car is a much bigger task than a lot of people would think, especially if you're new to it. Thankfully, like many things, it's best approached one step at a time. So that's exactly how I got started.
As weird as it sounds, I think I might actually try to do the front bumper next. This one, unlike the S4, we can actually do in a couple pieces and it'll look really good. So, we're gonna do that.
Bumpers are never easy. In fact, from my limited experience, I would say they are one of the hardest parts of the car. They're usually pretty intricate, and most times require a specific technique.
We can't really talk about wrapping a bumper until we talk about inlays.
The technique of an inlay is effectively using more than one piece of vinyl to effectively wrap one panel. You can hide the split between pieces in certain creases or body lines, and more often than not, the curves on the bumper are just too harsh for the vinyl to actually stick to without lifting up. So some cases, like the lower grills, you're literally just going to have to use them. So after looking at the bumper for a while, that was my approach. For context, the bumper on the S4 took multiple attempts, and a couple of those were just literally learning the best way to attack it. I foresee the exact same thing happening for the TT. So my reasoning for doing the bumper first is to just get a preliminary learning attempt in. I definitely don't expect this to be the final time we do the bumper, hence why I'm not going to explain the technique in detail. This is literally just me learning the shape and learning the best way to pull the material. Then at the very end, we'll go back and redo the bumper to make it look a lot better. I started the bumper like you would any sort of panel on the car. Cut out a piece larger than what you actually need and stretch it over the car to make it glossy. That gloss means there's no air bubbles, and you can go over it with a felt-covered squeegee to push out any that remain. Here you can see me attempting the lower inlay. Effectively, I'm going to try to hide the crease right where the bumper cuts in for those lower grills, and you really won't be able to see it if I do it right. Because after all, there's already a crease there, built right into the body lines. With that though, my first attempt at the bumper was complete, far from perfect, but we for sure learned enough, and I think the real attempt is going to go a whole lot better. Meaning we're good to move on to parts that I think we can do right the first time.
Fenders, on the other hand, are one of the easier parts of a car to wrap. Really, on Volkswagen cars, namely this Audi, all you have to worry about is not dropping the turn signal down behind it.
And for that, there's actually a pretty sweet trick that you can do using some double-sided tape. Using double-sided tape, you can suspend the light in the fender without losing it. That way, the surface is flat enough to prep. So speaking of prep, you'll notice in today's episode that I do a lot more wet sanding. More on that in a bit. For now, let's talk about something you're going to have to do for every panel. And it's something you could definitely mess up if you don't have a rough idea what you're doing. In order to wrap a panel, you need to kind of know the size of the panel so that you can cut out the right amount of vinyl. On the surface, that is really easy, but the more you think about it, the harder it gets. Cars are not flat, but we're trying to wrap it with a flat piece of material. Sure, it stretches, but you don't want to have to rely on that. So what you need to do is basically include a margin of error. Take your rough estimate of the height and width and add a little bit to it. Not enough that you're wasting material, but enough so that you know you don't need to stretch the material in order to make it fit. Sometimes that can work, but it's not a situation I recommend. Something I've read is that the more experienced you are with this, the less excess you actually need. And that makes sense because after all, this measurement is a fundamental skill. It's hard to approximate a 3D space with a 2D amount of material, but all it does is just take a bit of practice. And as a complete beginner, what I suggest is use more material than you think you need. It's easy to trim material, but almost impossible to add it, so you'll probably end up wasting less overall. Since I intend to keep this panel, let's talk some general techniques. The first thing I always do when I look at a panel I'm wrapping is look for the flattest part. In our case, the little lip around the wheel well. Once we get the material in place, that's the part that I'm going to tack down first. I use my felt-covered squeegee to make sure there are no air bubbles. I also decided to cut out the wheel to make sure there was less tension in the actual material. So here's where it gets a little more technical. We're going to do something that I like to call reading the creases. This material is naturally stretchy, but since we're wrapping it over something that is effectively a slice of a sphere, it's naturally going to bunch up. So what do? Effectively, what I do is break it into small sections. If there's a crease vertically, you need to relieve that tension before you can press it down with a squeegee. And to relieve that tension, all you need to do is pull the material perpendicular to the crease itself. So if the crease is up and down, then pull it left and right, and vice versa. And then you really just continue this process for the entirety of the shape. And as far as the edges go, it's rather simple. You want to cut it so that you have just a little bit of excess, and then you want to tuck that excess into whatever panel is on the other side. Oh yeah, and about the turn signal. Remember that double-sided tape? Well, what we want to do right now is cut a little slit and pull that double-sided tape and the light it's attached to through the hole. Then we can use a little bit of heat and press out all of the air so that the vinyl conforms to this little indent. And then it's as simple as reinstalling the light itself, meaning our fender is complete. The first fender went really well. It's an attempt that is more than good enough to keep. Plus, we didn't even have to use that much heat, so I guess what you could say is we're ready to start the other side. Though I'd say there's another technique we should chat about first.
I guess we should also talk about heat.
So there's a lot of tutorials for how to use a heat gun for vinyl. Heat gun this, heat gun that, but not a lot of people really say why. This material is pretty cool. One way to think of it is it's a material with a memory, and you can think of heat as a way to access that memory. That'll make a lot of sense in just a second. For now, look at how much I destroyed this piece. There's cracks, there's creases, it's stretched, and some would say it's completely unusable. Believe it or not, this material remembers how it looked before, and the only thing we need to do to get it to go back is use a bit of heat. The heat can effectively fix imperfections in the film. Got a crease? Heat it up. Stretched it too much? Heat it up. Or if you need to stretch it in a really weird way, heat it up beforehand. It gives you a lot more flexibility in what the material can actually do and what shapes it can hold. But one thing to note is don't heat it too much. All materials have a limit, and if you heat vinyl too much, you can completely compromise how it works. Once it's past heating up and starts melting, there's no going back. This is what it looks like when it's actually done. Basically half a second before it would tear. So all I'm getting at is when you see me use a heat gun on a panel, what you know I'm doing is effectively resetting a crease in the material. In other words, making sure I can lay it down completely flat. So let's get back to the next fender. This one follows the same exact process. You're also going to notice that the further back we go on the car, the more sanding I start doing. Basically, the further back we go, the more orange peel there is and the more peeling the paint actually does. So what I'm doing is basically prepping the surface to be as flat as physically possible. Any orange peel on the paint is going to show through unless we get rid of it. So that's exactly why I'm sanding it. Look at that. With this fender done, we've effectively attempted the entire front of the car. So in other words, we've taken one giant step closer to our goal. But we've still got a long way to climb, and it's definitely getting steeper.
Doors are a step up from fenders. While they are relatively flat, the issues lie in the accessories we need to remove.
those being the respective mirror and the handle. Let's start with the easier of the two. The mirror itself simply pops out with a couple clips. Then in here, there's a wire clip you can pop out, followed by a metal bracket that's holding it in place. With a little persuasion, they come out towards you, and then all that's holding it in place is the wires for the motor. With that removed, the mirror cap comes right off. And then we can talk about removing the base, which is held on with two different Torx bolts, both of which come off very easily. Remember, to get this door to look good, we want to do it in as few pieces as possible, meaning I don't want to have to worry about wrapping around this. I just like to wrap over it. While we're looking at this, let's talk about feather sanding, because this area is peeling quite bad. Unlike wet sanding, for feather sanding, I'm going to use a much more coarse sandpaper. My goal is to basically smooth out where the paint is peeling. If you can feel a crease with your finger, you're going to be able to see it through the vinyl. So I'm sanding it to the point where you actually can't. That way you're not going to see it whatsoever. Next, let's talk about the door handle. This is shockingly easy to remove. Behind the weatherproofing, there is a hidden little Torx bolt in here. While holding the handle open, if you turn this bolt to the left, eventually the little cylinder with the lock on it will be able to be just pulled out. If it seems stuck, keep turning it left and keep trying. Eventually it'll come loose very easily. Then you can just slide it right out. And from here we can remove the handle with one more step. All that's holding the handle in is a cable, which you can simply push out of place. Then you just pull the handle out like normal and it'll come right out. And with that, we're good to wet sand the inside of the handle and the entire door, meaning we're ready to wrap. And the cool thing about the door, now that we have all the accessories removed, is that it is a seriously flat panel. So if you pull it tight and gloss it out initially, there's not really a whole lot you have to do. Just go slowly and use heat around the handle itself. That little indent for the handle is really the only new part here. But so long as you take your time pushing the air out towards both of the holes, you're good to go. You're also going to have to wrap the handle itself. And here's where you want to be careful. There's two tabs on the back that hold the handle in place, and they're very easy to break. Ask me how I know that. Our handle's going to functionally work, but it won't sit right. So we're going to have to get a new one eventually. For now though, we can reinstall everything. And for the lock, that means you push in the cylinder, pull the door handle out, and turn that screw to the right. And this part can be pretty finicky, so I definitely suggest you don't dismantle both door handles at once, because if you do it wrong, you're going to lock yourself out of your car. So better safe than sorry. With the door handle tested and working, we're good to move on to the mirror. But first, you see how it's not setting fully right? That's because the tab's broke. Not a big deal, because these are weirdly cheap. As far as the mirror goes, let's get the little base on first. I cut out the 3 holes that were into this door, and then I fished the wire out. From here, I wrapped the base and reinstalled it with the same 2 Torx bolts. So far it's looking really clean, but let's talk about mirrors. Mirrors are one of the hardest parts of a car to wrap. Good. They're usually incredibly curved, and the TT's mirrors are effectively spheres. So in other words, they put a ton of strain on the material itself, and they really test the wrap. What makes it even more difficult though is the amount of paint that's peeling on my mirrors specifically. I knew this would be a headache, so I looked into some alternatives. I like darker mirrors, so at first I was thinking carbon, but they're like $500. And with this car's turbo having a foot out the door already, that money could be used way better somewhere else. But I still want dark mirrors, so I thought smarter, not harder, and I found a set of OEM black ones for really cheap, like $50 for a set. Not only will they satisfy my need for a darker mirror, but they're actually going to match the gloss black trim on all of our Aero that we have. So in all honesty, they might even look better than carbon. They're really going to tie the styling together. They're not perfect, but they're not peeling like mine, so they're a notable upgrade. And as far as installing these goes, you slide the mirror on, put the bracket and clip back into place, usually with some persuasion from a hammer, and then you can reinstall the glass. One step closer to a finished car. And honestly, I am very happy with how this door turned out. I'll show you at the end, but these doors turned out so much better than the ones on the B5. So in other words, I'm already starting to fulfill my learning objective, and I can move on to the second door, which is the same exact process. So let's talk orange peel and sanding again. This car has never been glossy. In fact, you can probably see the reflection from this angle. That is about as good as it has ever been. So this wrap has some serious potential to transform the car, hence why I'm actually spending almost an hour per panel sanding. If your car has good paint already, you don't have to do this at all. This is just something extra I have to do because this car was resprayed before I bought it. So if you're worried about sanding, don't feel like you have to wrap your car. Unless you have crappy paint like me, of course. In that case, we're in the same boat. But this goes to show you that it's possible to get a really good finish with crappy paint. I mean, even before this panel's done, you can already tell just how much glossier this section is going to be. This vinyl's got a killer finish, and we're not even done. I also learned from my previous mistake with the door handle on the other side, and this one didn't break, so it sits perfectly, meaning we can jump onto this side's mirror. With this mirror finally in place, we're good to move on to the rear quarter panel. This is probably the piece on the car where you're going to use the largest amount of vinyl at once, but that by no means makes it the hardest part. It's really just a combination of all the skills we've learned up to this point. The only real new part here is that we're going to be removing this little gas cap and the taillights, only to give us a little more room. I'm keeping the aluminum gas cap on the car, and we're going to treat it similar to how we treated the lights on the fenders, where we're going to wrap over it, cut a slit, and then pull it through at the end. And just like before, we're going to do a ton of wet sanding. This car has so much orange peel that it seriously needed it, and I think it's going to make all the difference at the end. You also might notice I'm using an electric sander to get rid of a bunch of the bulk orange peel. Then I'm going through at the end with a sanding block and traditionally wet sanding it. I saw that from some bodywork guy online, and it seems to work pretty well. See what I was talking about with the huge panel though? This piece effectively spans the entire length of the car. So once you get it in place, you're going to want to trim it a lot before you remove the backing. On a normal car, you could use something like magnets to get it to really hold out where it's going to be. But the TT is a little quirkier than that because the body is made out of aluminum. So magnets don't do anything but get in the way. So as far as the techniques go, the rear half feels exactly like the front fender because, well, it's the same shape. And the part that goes towards the door, believe it or not, has the same shape and feel as the doors. The only real difficult part about this piece is tucking it into the rear window. Something about that weatherproofing just makes it a little tough to tuck it into. Just take your time and you'll be fine. See what I was talking about, how this is similar to the light bulb from the front? Basically just cut a small hole, heat it up, and pull it through. Then you can tuck the material behind it and it's flush. And then you don't have to worry whatsoever about reassembling it. With this rear quarter panel done, I want to spend the rest of this weekend learning. My goal is to basically attempt every type of panel. That way I can come in next weekend and finish it, meaning we're moving towards the rear.
So similar to a front bumper, a rear bumper is going to require patience. Not nearly as much though.
Do you remember what I said about inlays in the front? How you can use body lines on a car to completely hide them? Well, just look at how many body lines there are on this rear. This rear bumper is going to be pretty straightforward. So I figured before we give that a try, we should talk about the rear hatch. And to wrap that properly, we're going to need to remove the wing. After a couple clips, the trim comes off, revealing 4 bolts holding the wing in place. That's not all that's holding this puppy on though. With those bolts removed, we need to scrape off all of the factory double-sided tape underneath this. And this is a terribly annoying process. While doing this, just remember one thing. Patience is a virtue. With the wing removed, we can scrape off the rest of the double-sided tape with a razor blade, and then we can start feather sanding to hide all of the peeling paint, followed by, you guessed it, wet sanding. This is starting to really come together. As far as wrapping this piece goes, my suggestion is to tack down the part around the window first. Whenever there's a crease like this, you need to make sure that the material is relaxed in that crease. Remember, this stuff has a memory when it's heated, so unless the material is relaxed when it's in that crease, the second you drive it in the sun, it's just gonna lift. So because of that, that part is where you need to start here. And with this mostly complete, I was running out of time for the weekend, especially since I was still working on that music video I was hired to direct. We definitely got a lot done though. To further my analogy from the beginning, we've attempted pretty much every type of panel we're going to need to deal with, and we know exactly what to expect from what remains. So, in other words,
well, at the end of the day, we made it, but we're not quite done.
We've still got to do the other rear quarter panel, break the bumper up into sections, and then the side skirts. Plus, then we got to look at the whole car and see if there's any panels we want to redo that we think we could do better. But compared to everything we did today, you can almost say that's all going downhill. Plus, so far the car is absolutely stunning. I mean, let's be honest, she's clearly not done. But if you've been following this channel for a while, this is the glossiest and most reflective this car has ever looked. Like, ever. This car basically started with a matte finish. So this is pretty wild to me. And I am super stoked to see it on the rest of the car. If you're at all considering trying this on your own car and you've never done it before, I, as a beginner, totally suggest it. There's definitely a learning curve, but who's to say that learning isn't fun? This is a really enjoyable and very satisfying process. And honestly, it definitely can improve the look of your car. So if you're at all on the fence about trying it, go ahead. In my mind, you're never really going to regret trying something. So it's worth it. Thank you so very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. I have a ton planned for the channel, so I hope you are as excited as I am. And if you're here for the other cars, don't worry, they're not going anywhere. I'm just borrowing the garage for this wrap, so I've got to finish this one first. They'll be back soon though. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you again, have a wonderful day.